All right, so we have a couple of people still joining us, but I'm going to get us started. So thank you everyone for joining today for this presentation of the National 303D Restoring Our Impaired Waters webinar series. Today our webinar is on collaboration and partnership in water quality improvements. We're really excited to be joined today by Olivia Devereux and James Martin, but first a little bit about me. My name is Courtney Botello, she, her, and I am an environmental analyst with NEIWPCC. And I'll talk a little bit more about our organization later. But today, as I mentioned, we are joined by Olivia and James. Olivia is an environmental scientist with Devereux Consulting. She has expertise in developing management systems that enhance, maintain, protect, and improve land and water resources. She is an expert in developing linked watershed and DMP modeling systems. She is the scientific lead in developing CAST, a TMDL planning and tracking tool. And she was also the scientific lead in developing the first Chesapeake Bay program scenario builder. James Martin is the director of the Division of Soil and Water Conservation with the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. James is an experienced environmental manager, having served the Commonwealth of Virginia for 25 years in various positions, working predominantly on Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. He has represented Virginia in leadership positions at the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, which includes the Chesapeake Bay Commission and EPA and other Bay jurisdictions. So a little bit more about NEIWPCC. NEIWPCC is a regional commission which helps states of the Northeast preserve and advance water quality. With support from EPA, we've been running this webinar series since 2016 as part of our work to develop and coordinate training programs for water quality professionals. As always, the views presented today represent the views of the speaker and do not necessarily represent NEIWPCC or EPA endorsement or positions. A couple of quick Zoom reminders. We ask that you please stay on mute and keep your camera off during our presentation today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to ask those in the chat. If you have any specific questions on the slides, we will do our best to answer those as we go along, but we will have time at the end for any additional questions as well. And if you're having any trouble hearing, feel free to ask any questions in the chat, or you can try using your audio phone. There's this little kind of button over here next to the unmute that you can use to switch over to a phone audio. After the webinar, we'll be sending out a brief survey. It'll appear in the chat. We'd really love your feedback on this webinar and on any future topics you'd like to see covered. We would also encourage you to propose a webinar. A couple of our priority topics include climate change, environmental justice, and cross-CWA program collaboration. There is some funding available for eligible applicants. If you would like to learn more or submit an informal abstract, you can visit NEIWPCC.org/303D TMDL webinar, or you can reach out to me with any questions. For these abstracts, we're really just looking for kind of a brief summary of what you would be interested in presenting. You don't need to have a comprehensive idea of your webinar. And I just want to highlight a couple other things that are going on at NEIWPCC. The first thing is the Clean Water Pod. This is a podcast that we've been working on with Jeff Berkus. And we recently put out our TMDL episode. This is available at Spotify, Apple Music, and wherever else podcasts are found. Our NPS conference is still accepting registration until March 31st, 2023. To learn more about that, you can visit our website. It should be right on our homepage. And then you can also follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn to keep up with the latest in events and conferences. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to today's presenters.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Let me begin to share my screen here and get that going. My name is Olivia Devereux. Thank you for the nice introduction. I use the pronouns she and her, and we will get started. So please feel free to put questions in the chat, and I will also pause occasionally for y'all to ask audio questions. But we'll go ahead and get started. What we're going to do is James and I are going to walk through this outline. We're going to talk about what it's like collaborating and coordinating in the Chesapeake Bay watershed among the state's federal agencies, local governments, environmental nonprofits. We will talk about the process used to develop goals and plans, what some of the pitfalls have been, what's worked, and then really importantly, tracking progress toward those plans and reevaluating goals. We will talk about what we've found as successful for how to engage folks when there's no regulatory control, and the data that we've used. So some of that is our online data that people can use to engage stakeholders, what's led to unanimity, and also what has not worked so well and led to divisions between our Chesapeake Bay watershed partners. We will also talk about how the balance between federal and state regulatory oversight process has worked through both the planning and implementation and enforcement process. So that's a lot to cover, and we're going to try and make this fun for y'all. So I appreciate y'all hanging in there while we go through the history of the Chesapeake Bay and showing you what's worked for us. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed has a very long history of watershed agreements. We started work in the mid-'80s. States started reporting their best management practices, or BMPs, in the late 90s, and that was all voluntary. There were some ideas that were put forward for goals. Those weren't met. There were lawsuits. There were GAO investigations about data handling. We ended up with the TMDL for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment in 2010. And there's been just this long history of lots of involvement from a lot of different people, whether it's states, feds, Congress, as well as local governments, and of course the environmental nonprofits driving this forward. I remember talking to a colleague in Australia who came for an information exchange session, and she was saying that they don't make much progress there, and I said, well, what's missing? What do we do that y'all don't do? And she said that they do all the same things in terms of the requirements, TMDLs, they're called something different, but what they don't have are lawsuits, so that when you're not making progress, you don't have the lawsuits that push things forward. So I thought that was an interesting perspective that I hadn't really thought about. We're going to talk about the difference between monitoring and modeling and how we need both, and we'll dive into that a little deeper later on. And then we're going to talk about the challenges with the multiple source sectors. We work with the developed or urban areas. We used to call them all urban. Now we call it developed as a more accurate term. The natural areas, meaning forests and wetlands or open grassland, unmanaged grassland, the agricultural areas, as well as wastewater and other point sources. And we'll talk about what those administrative divisions between counties, local governments, conservation districts, and the states and federal agencies mean when we actually get into the nitty-gritty of developing plans, the TMDL, what it was like before and after the TMDL, and measuring progress. The Chesapeake Bay is made up of 6 states. So we go from New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as the District of Columbia. We have multiple federal agency landholders. We have DOD. We have the largest naval base in the world located in Virginia. And that's not an exaggeration. It really is the largest naval base in the entire world. I'm sure they're maybe getting smaller as we see sea level rise, and that's starting to take over, and they're doing planning around that. And that's another issue that's not even covered in our TMDL. And then we have all these local governments that have different local government priorities and ways of governing between the states. And of course, MS4s, conservation districts, and departments of transportation that all have their own mandates in addition to having to meet the TMDL mandates. And then all those interested parties, the big one on the block is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, but there are dozens and dozens of other smaller ones. All the water keepers, which are part of the Waterkeeper Association, come together. councils of governments, along with all those other different parties that y'all have in your watersheds as well. So there's a lot of people involved, and just organizing all of those people, all those interested parties is a beast unto itself. But we've been doing it for a while, and we've gotten pretty good at all of the processes. So I wanted to show you a little bit about the watershed, just kind of orient you if you're not used to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I just got back from a trip from California and was pleased to visit San Francisco, and I saw the Bay watershed model there. That was so much fun. And we compared notes there about the San Francisco Bay and its watershed and the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. We both have big bays, but the drainage area to our bay is 64,000 square miles. That's a lot of watershed area draining to that. Our airshed is coming over from from the Midwest here. We get a lot of the Midwest air from coal-fired power plants and others blowing over into our watershed. And so we get the air from a lot broader area. We have 18 million people, and it's growing. Everyone wants to live next to the water. And we have not yet figured out how to create, zoning that limits the number of people in an aggressive way. And then we have 78,000 family farms, along with the big farms that y'all know. But we've got a lot of small farms. A lot of those are also from the plain folk community, thinking, Amish, other plain folk communities that have their own way of doing business. We have, and I just counted these, 470 significant and over 3,000 non-significant dischargers. So that's quite a lot of discharge. We used to only track the significant dischargers, thinking the non-significants were non-significant. It's not true. It turned out that ended up being bigger than the significance because there are so many of those non-significant discharges, all those package plants that add up to quite a bit. We have over 10,000 miles of shoreline, and the bay itself has an average depth of 21 feet. And the ratio of watershed to tidal surface waters is 15:1. So it's a big, messy watershed with lots going on. On the map, I've got the points for where we have our monitoring stations, and we've got a lot of monitoring. There's never enough, but those are the major watersheds that are monitored. And I thought you'll be interested to see that. We have a lot more monitoring stations for shorter periods of time for only specific pollutants, but those are the major ones that have everything in them for a long period of time. So I want to just give you a little bit more information on the history. In the 60s and 70s, there was a visible decline in the bay resources. I'm talking about, we're looking at the ducks, we're looking at the oysters, we're looking at the blue crab that the bay is famous for. We're talking about the fishing. There was a visible decline in what people could see and in the water quality in the streams and rivers that drain to the bay. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation is the nonprofit that was founded in 1967. And they really pushed EPA to conduct a study to say, is it really declining? Is it just our observations? What is it that is being seen? Let's get EPA involved. In 1980, the Chesapeake Bay Commission was established. The Bay Commission is made up of state legislators from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. It has those what we call the headwaters. It has the states that are directly border the Chesapeake Bay, but not the headwater states. Headwater states would be those like New York and West Virginia that are a little bit farther away. And then in 1983, we had the first Bay Agreement. That was an agreement signed by all of these political folks. I should have pulled out that photo because it's funny to see how people dressed back then. But we had the Bay program created with the signing of that first Bay Agreement, and they committed to improving the health of the Bay. Then we had our second Bay Agreement 4 or 5 years later, and it named a goal of 40% reduction in pollutants. And we started to have specific goals for water quality. We amended it and said we have to not just have a goal, we need to have a plan. And that's where we got tributary strategies. And those TRIB strategies carried on all the way through the early 2000s. And we had a third Bay Agreement that tried to add a little bit more teeth to those TRIB strategies. And then it became acknowledged that, hey, we're not meeting those TRIB strategies. And there were lawsuits. And that led to EPA saying, yes, we're not going to be able to meet those Bay impairments by 2010. We're going to have a TMDL for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And that TMDL was established in 2010. And at that point, the TMDL held each state major basin accountable. So in Delaware, there's only one basin. In Maryland, there are 5 different major basins. Pennsylvania has the Susquehanna. In New York is just the Susquehanna. But, you know, we've got, and the Potomac is a little bit in Pennsylvania. So I think that Virginia and Maryland have the most basins in their states, but each major basin has its own TMDL draining to a segment in the bay, and the state is held accountable for that. And so we have a lot more accountability with the Bay TMDL. And then in 2014, after many years of work, we ended up with a 4th Bay Agreement that is focused on the watershed restoration. And this time it's not solely focused on water quality, meaning nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. It's also focused on goals for 30 other outcomes, looking at black ducks, looking at blue crabs, looking at acres of wetlands. There are a whole bunch. You can find those on the Chesapeake Bay program website, and I could point you to more specific details. But that Bay Agreement is really important because it broadened it out. So we said, okay, even if we meet all of our water quality requirements that are in the TMDL, we still won't have a healthy bay. So we want to make sure we're looking at all of these other elements. And that's helpful because we can say when we're working on water quality, we're also working on these other priority benefits or co-benefits, and vice versa. The TMDL established an interim target of reaching 60% of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment load reductions. That was not met by all states, but we continued to plunge forward. We brought in new data, we developed new targets, and then in 2022, that was last fall, we acknowledged that the 2025 deadline for the TMDL would not be met. It's pretty evident that we're not close enough. We're not going to get there. We will still do an assessment of where we are in 2025, but we know that we're going to have new goals and look beyond that. And we don't have another deadline yet, but we are going to work as a partnership to develop one. But the original goal is that in 2025, we would have all the practices implemented that would achieve the required nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment load reductions and meet our EPA TMDL allocations. Again, we know we're acknowledging that's not going to be met. That's a major step forward to publicly acknowledge we're not going to meet that and that we need to continue to work. So that's where we are right now. I'm going to turn it over to James to talk a little bit about how Virginia has taken this structure and worked within it to develop local planning goals. James?
Thanks, Olivia. Good afternoon, folks. I'm James Martin. You can refer to me using he, him pronouns. I wanted to go ahead and pick up about the bottom third of that timeline Olivia just presented, starting in 2010, and really focusing in on our planning framework during that window, right? Implementation plan development. In 2010 was the development of the phase 1 watershed implementation plan. Each Bay jurisdiction developed their own plan. That plan was adapted into the Bay TMDL. The results of that plan actually became the load allocations established in the Bay TMDL. That planning process here in Virginia was a very short planning horizon. It resulted in us really establishing a state level plan. We staff in state agencies got together and talked about what was possible and what we thought might be able to be implemented to meet the load reduction targets that had been assigned to each state. And that's how we kind of developed that phase 1 WIP. It was, like I said, very much a high level state agency exercise. That process, as I said, had a very short time horizon, which necessitated it being done that way. But even at that time, we realized there was a need for more local engagement in the planning process, both with local government officials that obviously have a role in implementation, but also with representatives from the various source sectors, agriculture and wastewater and the development industry. We needed to hear from those folks as well. So in 2012, the Bay Program Partnership undertook a second round of watershed implementation planning with the goal of trying to further engage those local officials and source sector interests. The rest of these milestone cycles is really just on this list to show you that within the planning process, we actually have a 2-year iterative planning process or planning cycle where every 2 years we consider what implementation has occurred, adapt and manage and make modifications to our approach for the next 2-year cycle. So that continued on through the 2017 midpoint assessment that Olivia included on her slide, and continues through to this day. After the midpoint assessment, we did enter, there was the development of a new version of our modeling tools, and we used that as an opportunity to again revisit our longer term watershed implementation plan. This was the phase 3 watershed implementation plan, and those milestone cycles will continue on a 2-year process out through 2025. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Olivia, thank you. I did want to point out that while Olivia and I both, as most folks do, you'll hear us refer to the Chesapeake Bay TMDL in singular, but obviously she already mentioned there's 3 pollutants. So all of you folks on the call who are in this world of work recognize that it is not one TMDL, that there is a separate TMDL for each pollutant. But in the Bay, it's not just 3 TMDLs. And they're not just at the state basin scale. Here in Virginia, we actually have 39 different segment sheds. Baywide, there are 96. And for each of those segment sheds, we have separate TMDLs for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So here in Virginia, the Bay TMDL that we talk about in singular is really 117 unique TMDLs covering Virginia's portion of the Bay watershed. Next slide. Having been through 2 planning processes, the phase 1 and phase 2 WIP, it did provide us the opportunity as we moved forward toward 2017 and the phase 3 WIP planning process to look back and engage with some of the stakeholders that had participated in the previous planning processes and to find out what they thought worked and what didn't, so that we can try and make our plan more effective in that phase 3 WIP. A couple of the highlights that came out of that assessment of Bay stakeholders, you can see here. Equity among sectors. I'm sure that's not a new issue for anybody that's done this type of work. Building consensus for action among local governments and source sectors was another one that came out of the stakeholder assessment. Having enough time for your planning process was an important point. Engaging with elected officials. While staff at the state and at local governments are really the ones that do the work, most of them don't feel empowered until their elected officials say, yes, we're going to engage in this activity. So our outreach efforts needed to focus on elected officials as well as just working with staff to get the answers we need. So making information that we had available relevant to those local officials was what they said was the best way to try and engage them in the planning process and implementation to follow. Next slide. And we started it right from the state level. Our governor at the time, Governor Ralph Northam, recognized that our implementation progress was not on pace to meet the 2025 goals as we were moving forward through that 2017 timeframe. So we would engage in a new planning process, one that solicited input from local officials, prioritized nature-based solutions, and tackled the impact of climate change. So one important distinction in the phase 3 WIP process was that in addition to the previously identified reductions updated by our improved modeling, we also explicitly planned for and accounted for enough implementation to offset the effect of climate change through 2025. An important part of our planning here in Virginia. Thank you. EPA, as part of the Bay Program partnership, established expectations. These were largely negotiated expectations among the partners, the states, EPA, and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. But by 2025, make the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment load reductions necessary, right? Obviously, that's going to be a goal of any planning process, is to hit the target you're shooting for. We wanted both programmatic and numeric implementation commitments. So not only a plan for what implementation, what practices on the ground it would take, but how you're going to get those practices implemented through various programs and incentives. We wanted to incorporate co-benefits. Olivia touched on this topic. Understanding that dollars are always limited in implementation. If you can achieve multiple benefits with the same project, that project is going to be more acceptable, both at the funding organization level, as well as throughout that local regional chain. Wanted to engage local and regional as well as federal partners and establish local area planning goals. I'm going to focus much of the rest of my portion of the presentation on these last two bullets, engaging local partners and developing planning goals. So I guess the first question you have to answer if you're talking about local engagement is, what's local? What do you mean when you say local? The document that provided those expectations, again, partnership developed document, laid out a number of alternatives for what would satisfy the definition of local. In Virginia, we chose those elements that you see highlighted there. We engaged with federal facilities where there were federally owned lands. About 10% of Virginia's Chesapeake Bay watershed is federally owned. Soil and water conservation districts. Soil and water districts are our primary instrument to deliver agricultural implementation in the watershed. And regional entity, we chose to work with the local planning district commissions. Those planning districts historically had already been involved in regional scale planning and environmental planning at the regional scale. So we thought they were a good partner to join us as we tried to engage, instead of every local government official, those local government officials through their planning districts to which they are members. Next slide, please. So going back to that scale, one of the reasons we needed to use those those regional planning district commissions is that in Virginia's Bay watershed, we have 96 local governments, cities and counties. Those are the light colored lines on this map. Remember, the colored blobs are the segment sheds. Here, we have 5 major basins in Virginia, as Olivia alluded to. Those 96 local governments, cities and counties fall into 15 different planning district commissions. So just for an economy of scale, we needed a partner at that regional level, just because we didn't have the staff resources at the state to be able to engage with 96 localities on a one-by-one basis. There's also 32 soil and water conservation districts. I'm not sure if you can see it on the map, but those are separate lines, kind of the lighter green colored lines or yellow colored lines, maybe they show up. 32 of those fall within all are part within our Chesapeake Bay watershed. And we have more than 200 different federal land holding entities, which we engaged through the Bay program partnerships, federal facility work group. So really that was focused at the agency scale instead of dealing with every DOD facility, of which there's probably, I don't know, 40 or so across the Bay watershed. We dealt with DOD as a whole. So that tended to make things much easier. We also had to define how we were going to frame our planning goals. Again, those that have worked in this world, I think will recognize that there's lots of ways you can define that target, that goal that you're shooting for. These were some of the options, right? Do you want to define it as a percent reduction in loads? Do you want to define it as a specific load, like we do in the TMDL itself? What we chose was both a combination of quantifying implementation goals for particular BMPs, as well as having numeric nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions. So instead of talking about total loads, we talked about load differences between where we are at the time of planning and where we needed to be to meet the TMDL load targets, or in this case, our state basin planning targets. So that's how we defined the goals. Next slide, please. So then, okay, you want to do local engagement. We've defined local. So how are you going to engage them? Outreach meetings, right? We had regional outreach meetings with PDCs, soil and water districts. We actually, those soil and water districts, those 32 districts that exist in the Bay watershed of Virginia meet regularly as soil and water district areas, of which there are 4. So we use those area meetings as a way to, again, economy of scale, be able to communicate with all of those soil and water districts at a meeting they're already attending We also held a number of webinars for that outreach. Part of that outreach process is providing those local partners with the decision support tools they need to try and develop an implementation plan. Information about BMP cost effectiveness, information about the co-benefits that can be derived from particular practices, and a wide range of co-benefits. We considered, I think, over 30 different potential co-benefits along with water quality benefits as part of that decision-making. CAST, which Olivia is going to talk a lot more about, as well as monitoring trends, which she's going to touch on as well, was also important information that those local partners needed in order to both be engaged as well as develop effective plans. Yes, it's a blue crab on my coffee mug. Thank you. Appropriate for our Chesapeake Bay work. So here's a little more detail on exactly what our outreach plan looked like, kind of staged into different tiers of engagement. Local elected officials first. In Virginia, in addition to elected officials in local governments, our soil and water districts are also have a board of elected officials that oversee and approve the implementation actions of those individual districts. So we wanted to make sure we conveyed the big picture and goals and our plan for moving this process forward to all of those elected officials, and ask for their support with the staff that they had working for them to help us through the actual planning process. We then had this tier 2 level of meetings where we met with the local staff, both local government and soil and water districts, to kind of lay the outline for what the planning process was going to look like. We met with other groups as well, the Virginia Association of Counties, Virginia Municipal League, and the Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts, to make sure all of those kind of local government hierarchy organizations were also aware and helping us communicate this planning process out to local governments. Then came the real work, right? That's kind of the outreach, the engagement piece, and then the actual planning process work, which was really the far more time-consuming bit, where we actually provided those soil and water districts and PDCs with local planning goals, turned them loose with the decision support tools, and asked them to come back to us with implementation scenarios. The planning targets that we provided them, again, having been through a planning process already, we had a framework to start from. We started with the exact implementation that was laid out in our phase 2 implementation plan using the new modeling system. In addition to accounting for climate change, which I touched on already, we also, the partnership all agreed to run the WIP 3 planning scenario on forecasted 2025 land use conditions, effectively setting up a plan that explicitly would account for anticipated growth, whether that's growth, say, in the poultry industry, or growth in terms of additional development and impervious surfaces. Let's see, we asked the planning district commissions in their planning process to focus on the non-MS4, non-federal developed lands. So anything that was in or around the vicinity of impervious surfaces and residential areas at any density. So not just urban, anything developed. We also asked them to focus on the septic sector, as well as the natural sector, focusing on streams and shorelines, because those obviously where they have residences, closely located are the areas most likely to see implementation activity. Soil and water conservation districts, again, engaged at the area scale. They were focused on agriculture as well as silviculture, the harvested forest, as well as stream and shorelines that intersected those agricultural lands.
James, I just want to cut in here and point out that this is the approach that Virginia took. Other states took a different approach, and you can really tell in terms of the rate of progress toward meeting the TMDL. Because Virginia focused on the all developed land, not just the regulated land, they are making faster progress. They did not leave out the septic sector. They're like, no, we need to make sure that those septic tanks are pumped on a regular basis. We need to make sure they're hooked up to wastewater when the land gets dense, when it gets dense enough population. And you can really see Virginia's progress because of these decisions. And when they went out to do these local area planning goals, James mentioned this, but ever so briefly, and I want to just drive the point home, they looked at where the current estimated load was and where they needed to be in meeting that difference. Other states did not look at just that difference, which is easy to get your head around, easy to comprehend. Other states said, here's where we were in 2009, here's where we need to be in 2025. Other states looked at maybe here's our level of implementation of BMPs, here's where we want to be without looking at loads. You know, but the way it's done and the way it's presented was certainly up to the states. It's not anything that's mandated. The mandate is that they meet the TMDL, but the approach is up to the states. And Virginia is being highlighted because they did such an exceptional job in doing this. And James is probably not able to portray how aggressive and broad-reaching Virginia's plan was compared to some of the other states, but it's really admirable the direction that they took, whereas some other states that kind of backed off and said, no, we'll just do what we can, which is regulated land. And here you see Virginia focusing on non-regulated as well. Excuse me for jumping in, James.
Thank you, Olivia. You made me blush. Thank you for the kind words. It was a significant planning process, right? We talked about making sure you have enough time. Our process from those original engagement meetings with local governments through the time when we got back from them their implementation scenarios, it was close to 2 years. So it takes time. You have to plan enough time. And I think one of the biggest mistakes made early in the early WIPs planning process was just that. We didn't give ourselves enough time to let the local elected and local staff at those governments, PDCs, and soil and water districts really dig their teeth into this information. So essentially, when we had these meetings with staff, those tier 3 meetings that I touched on, each PDC and soil and water district was given a spreadsheet. You know, that spreadsheet was specific. This one is the excerpts from the PDC version. So again, it's focused on developed natural and septic loads. But we did want to share with them what their local regulated loads were and what the reductions expected to be derived from those regulated loads were, right? Not that we were asking to do anything in the planning process with it, but because we thought it was an important part of the picture, right? You have to understand how you fit into the bigger picture. Went all the way back to that assessment survey that was done. So we showed them what the 2017 load was for nitrogen and phosphorus. We showed them what the WIP2 load was and what the reduction needed to get back to those planning targets were. That's how we framed our local area planning goals. These were developed at each PDC scale, specifically based on the land use and conditions and model outputs that we had for those regions. In addition to the load details, we provided them with a list of the best management practices, the level that had been implemented through 2017, what the WIP phase 2 WIP called for in terms of additional implementation. And then we asked them to build a scenario for 2025 that achieved similar levels of reductions as was called for in the phase 2 WIP. And that would allow them to then meet their planning goals. Here it is. Yeah. Evaluate 2017 progress BMPs, make sure those practices are reasonable at the local level, which we had kind of already done through the phase 2 planning process, less so in phase 1 WIP. Wanted to make sure that they understood the importance of correcting errors where we found them, making sure data was reported correctly. If they knew of implementation that wasn't showing up on that spreadsheet, hey, you don't have a record of this practice, whatever, choose one that we know was implemented. It should be in there. We invited them to correct those errors, and we could include that into our process. We wanted them to make sure the WIP 2 scenario, figure out what was working, what wasn't, and then develop that phase 3 WIP BMP scenario, focusing on the practices that are most cost effective, data that was also available to them in that spreadsheet, considering the co-benefits they could derive from that best management practice, data that we linked back to CAST, and those links were available in that one spreadsheet, and shooting to meet their local area planning goals. And since we were dealing with multiple pollutants, we asked them to focus on the nitrogen loads. Early assessment in the planning process told us that if we met our nitrogen targets, our phosphorus targets would be achieved as well. So it's always easier to talk about things in singular, right? Instead of trying to hit multiple targets with the same implementation scenario, just focus on one and it makes your planning process a little bit easier. Finally, and importantly, we asked them to develop the programmatic and policy recommendations. What would they need at that local government level to see those implementation scenarios that they developed implemented? What funding, what capacity, what statutory authority, what new programs? And I can tell you from the agricultural side, we had hundreds, literally hundreds of recommendations come from our soil and water conservation districts about changes they thought we should or could consider making to our agricultural cost share program at the state level to try and drive that implementation. All of those went through an established process with a technical advisory committee, and many of them have now been implemented into part of our program. So, not just focusing on establishing or creating an implementation scenario, but also recognizing that your ultimate goal of having an implementation plan is really to have implementation. So asking that important question of what's it going to take? And anybody, I'd love to see a raise of hands if you're surprised to hear that more funding was always one of the answers. So I think that's my last slide, Olivia. Throw it back to you.
I know coming out of that discussion, at some point when the WIP phase 3 watershed implementation plan, or WIP, was being developed, that there was some acknowledgement that there are a lot of horses in Northern Virginia that are not, the pasture is not well managed, the manure is not well managed, and you've got several horses on an acre or less, and that's not enough land for those horses. And DCR, which manages the agricultural side, was looking to put in place some sort of regulation, some sort of rule to manage, to require that there be at least an acre per horse or something along those lines. I don't know where that ended up, but I know that that's one of the things that came to light through this intense planning process as something that needed to be addressed in a formal way. And that's just one of those literally hundreds that James mentioned. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about where we are on planning and tracking. So once you have a plan, and each state did it differently, and if you have any doubt that states are not allowed to do it differently, then you can put that to rest. The Supreme Court, this went to the Supreme Court through a series of lawsuits, and it has been determined that the states do have the right to determine the approach that works best for them. So they do it their own way. But we need to be able to talk about planning and tracking and measuring progress. So setting those goals is really important because that's how we track progress. This map shows the change in nitrogen load at edge of stream by year. Here, I believe I'm showing the 2025 expected load. The places that are high are Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Sussex County, Delaware. Those are the highest in this map. High poultry in Sussex and high level of animal agriculture in general, but also poultry in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So those goals have to be set. We have to have a collaborative process to make sure everybody's on board with that roadmap, and you have to do it with the point sources. I know those are regulated, but you have to make sure everybody on the point source side is on board, and also the non-point source is looking at multiple classes. I used to hope that we could all, work collaboratively between ag and urban. It never really worked out that way. Ag goes their way and urban goes their way, but nonetheless, we have to, jointly achieve the goals. That is why the model has been important, because it is able to parse out the load that comes from ag versus developed or urban land classes. The states use CAST. It's an online model, and that tracks their BMP implementation. So we have all the BMPs in there, and it also shows the expected load with all those BMPs implemented. And so CAST is an important tool, and there are lots of maps like the one we show here that are part of CAST. And the states do submit the data, and it helps them make decisions, helps them decide where to focus moving forward. The data that James put together in the spreadsheets for each local planning district commission came from CAST. So it's a really important one-stop shop for people to go and get information in detail, as well as looking at kind of an overall trend over time or picture for where things are. The pollutant load reductions, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, total suspended sediment, those load reductions from BMPs are modeled, and you can go to CAST and take a look at some of that. CAST is the static watershed model, and it also contains the official documentation for the model on the CAST site. It is the model that was used to inform the TMDL in 2010. The model has been updated since then. And it is also a tool that has been named for developing Maryland local TMDL plans and is referenced in Virginia's TMDL implementation plan guidance. So it is used for local TMDLs and for other uses, as well as the Bay TMDL. It's convenient to use it for all sorts of environmental planning, so that we have these nested goals that come together. For local plans, as well as the larger state or state basin and entire bay plans. So I talk about modeling, and we use CAST. I mentioned that last week I was in California and saw the Bay model, the San Francisco Bay model. That's a physical model. When I talk about, and it was so much fun, when I talk about modeling with CAST, that is a computer model, it's a hydrologic model. And that's the model I'm referring to in this case. We need both the modeling and the monitoring. The monitoring tells us what's actually happening, and as you all know, that is how we will eventually delist our waters, get them off that 303D list, and we get that real-time check on how we're doing. But we do use modeling to say, if we did this plan and it was all implemented, what would be our load? Would we be able to reach our planning goal, our target? So we need both of them, and we do calibrate our model to the monitoring data. Here is a graph for one station highlighted in blue, and I believe I'm showing nitrogen. Yes, total nitrogen. And you can see that the orange load is the weighted regression for time and distance for the monitoring data, and the blue is the modeled data. So not such good agreement in this area. A modeler would say that's fantastic agreement, but it is pretty good agreement, but it's the one that's farthest away. You know, we are right on the money in other years. So overall, we've got pretty good agreement at most stations. A lot of resources have gone into our modeling capacity. We need to make sure to do planning at a geographic scale that works for the scientist, for the land managers, and for planners. So we have done the geographic scale options in CAST for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, for an entire state, for each county, for major and minor basins. We have modeling segments which are not meaningful to anybody but modelers, but we do have that as a finer scale. We have all of the hydrologic unit codes, the HUCs. We have data that we have behind the scenes at the NHD, National Hydrography Data Set, 1 to 100,000 scale. And in Virginia, we have the additional areas for planning purposes, Planning District Commission, conservation districts, and conservation district areas. I resisted that. James really pushed on it and said, we need those. That's how we're going to get our WIP done. So we relented and said, okay, if that's what it takes, that's what we'll do. And I really appreciate James having pushed to get those additional planning scales into the model. The initial resistance is because we try and keep it as simple as possible. And that's just not always possible because we want to meet everybody's needs. So here's where it gets sticky. We want to engage people where there's no regulatory requirement. So this gets down to kind of the carrot and the stick when you talk about, you know, public policy. So from a federal perspective, the way that we engage people is we need to look at a collaborative approach for meeting the Bay TMDL. And we've got this Bay TMDL. It's a federal mandate, and we have these federal incentives. These are the carrots. USDA assistance programs. You know, we all know the EQIP. There was a Chesapeake Bay watershed one. We now have some others that are in place, depending on the latest Farm Bill. And then we have federal funded crop insurance programs, but also from USDA. And then we have grant programs like EPA 319 funding. We have enforcement actions. This is all EPA enforcement actions. The ones that have really been taken is EPA does the evaluation for an annual progress assessment. It evaluates the WIPs and the milestones. They hold regular meetings to look at the progress toward milestones. And then this is the one where you kind of get a little dig in, which is EPA has Chesapeake Bay RAP Regional Assistance Program and Chesapeake Bay Improvement Grants. So those CB RAP and CBIG grants are made to the states. We're talking millions here. If states are not making progress or following through on what they said, EPA has the right to withhold grant money. It has done that a couple of times for no longer than a day because the states immediately responded and reacted. So everybody got their money as was planned, but they did have to, you know, indicate they were going to withhold in at least 2 cases that I know of. So I know we've got about 30 minutes left, and I'm going to speed through the next slides. We do need to engage people at the state level. So the way we've done that is Virginia Department of Environmental Quality has stormwater local assistance funds, those SLAF funds. Other states have other general funds. They use those to incentivize progress, incentivize actions. We have a lot of private foundations and endowments that make grants. And then we have the permits. And that works well for phase 1, phase 2 MS4s, for post-construction regs, and for CAFOs. When we get outside of that, we have a little bit harder time getting people to move forward. The way we've been able to engage outside of the regulatory and enforcement is to really convey, and this is kind of like raising teenagers, where you realize you can no longer just say go do something. You got to say yes, and be a cheerleader and cheer them on and give them the positive encouragement. So we move into kind of teenager management here, and we engage people on the collective value of clean water. Nobody's against clean water. What they're against is spending money on one thing versus another thing. They're against mandates, perhaps. But if we engage people on clean water, on the natural resources, on the value of recreation, on fisheries and access to fisheries, and if we share information, like we look at, hey, the population's going up, we can look at, hey, we've got atmospheric deposition coming down. We've got point sources. That's been, we've got to address those. And we use the TMDL as the guiding mandate, then we're really able to make progress and get people to buy in. So the work that James did, working with the planning district commissions and conservation districts, really got people to buy in based on that collective value of clean water. So when we do this, we need to incorporate climate change, land use, demographic changes, and that's part of our updates to the model that we did at the midpoint assessment in 2016, 2017 is when that came out, so that we began to take that into account. So we do have these scheduled, planned into the model. And so that we can take into account these changes that we see in the environment. Let me move to the next slide. This is just a screenshot of CAST and our screen and how we have data available. You don't even have to log in, and you can go and look at a whole lot of information. Some of that includes satellite imagery. We use satellite imagery for our land use. We do not use it for tracking progress toward the TMDL. States could use that if they have plans for how to do perhaps windshield surveys. We've got a lot of QA/QC built into that, where you got to go back and double check like 10% of those. We could use it for some things, but it's hard to tell the difference between a cover crop and a winter wheat from satellite imagery. So we do tend to stick more toward data collection of what's on the ground, but it's not ruled out. It's just there are a lot of challenges with doing that satellite imagery. So using partner engagement is critical. We're all using CAST. If people think CAST is not useful, if they don't have any buy-in to CAST, if they think it's got wrong data in it, they're not going to go buy it. There's not going to be buy-in. We can't get on the same page and move forward as a partnership. So when we developed CAST, we had it in 5 years of development, calibration, a full year of review, back and forth, lots of discussions before we finally had approval to use it as the model. We made changes. Partners, states pointed out issues with CAST, said, hey, we don't think this is a good data source. Hey, we think something's wrong here. We would go back, we would dig in, we would fix it until we were all satisfied. We had workshops, a whole series of workshops to incorporate feedback and get direction from a whole lot of partners, not just the official partners that sign on to the Chesapeake Bay Agreement and those who are responsible for implementing TMDLs, but partners like the nonprofit community as well. We had multiple beta versions as we went through the iterations. We've had extensive independent scientific peer review and publications. And then we reached a point where we were ready to say, okay, we're doing a fatal flaw review. Tell us what the fatal flaws are. And then we addressed those, and we got and kept a whole long document of what those were and how we addressed them before we finally had the senior policymakers sign off. So this long and I will say tedious, time-consuming process that took a lot of people doing everything from meeting minutes and posting those minutes to websites. It is tedious. It is also necessary to maintain engagement and transparency. It's a lot of work, but I don't think there's a shortcut. When we've tried to take a shortcut, we realize that we've got to go back and start over and get everybody's engagement and make sure that we're clear about everything that we're doing in terms of modeling and monitoring and tracking and WIP development. So we use CAST for the implementation plans and to track the BMPs. States report BMPs to the Bay program. We import that into the model, and that gives us the estimated load reductions from all those BMPs that are implemented and functioning in each year. So we have an annual progress scenario for every year from 1985 through 2022, and we have our proposed scenario for the WIP for 2025, and we have a land use for each of those years too. And states are using the tool for their own scenarios tied to their login name. Anybody can have a login, can run scenarios. It's funny to me because we have a Norwegian CAST users group who are running scenarios, doing research in the Chesapeake Bay. We have a group from Minnesota who are doing work in the Chesapeake Bay. So we have lots of people from all over the world really using CAST for different purposes. But what they all have in common is that they look at what the programmatic goals are. They know their load targets. They know the co-benefits that are a priority. They know the costs. We have costs in there, but they know what their limits are. That's translated to BMPs. You run a scenario, determine if you're meeting your numeric goals. If not, you got to revise some of those goals, go about it a different way. That's the process everyone has to go through. It's those clear and consistent goals make it easy to do the modeling. For the BMPs, we have all kinds of BMP data, including a protocol for the development of new BMPs that are accepted into the model. I am showing here a graph of the BMPs implemented by sector and year. I believe this is in Virginia, showing what's gone on. It's gotten harder in the last few years, but still, continuing to make efforts. But we have these data so that people can assess the trends over time. This ease of use we have, this is like people shopping on Amazon.com. If you want people to shop, you got to make it easy. Amazon wants to sell stuff. We want to sell implementation. So we make it easy to add and edit BMPs as well as to edit the cost so that if you don't like the default costs, you can make them more specific. So we allow people to input costs using different cost data, different cost formulas. Maybe someone wants to look at it over a 5-year time period. Maybe they want to say, what if we were to pay the entire cost now? What if we want to look at an average annualized cost? So we allow a lot of different options, but overall, it's basically driven by pop-up boxes and drop-down menus for people to make it easy to use. We also want to make sure people target. I know that in some sectors, targeting is, kind of a verboten word, but we really do need to target. And there are 3 different ways you can target. Am I looking at the right location? Am I looking at the right sector or land use within that sector? And am I looking at the right BMP and that's most cost effective? So we can integrate all of those, but I'm going to take them one at a time. And thanks to James, who prepared these really pretty slides. So left is phosphorus, right is nitrogen. What Virginia did is they looked at implementing in the highest loading areas to see where you could get the most bang for your buck. So yes, you could do BMPs down here, but let's look at where the load is the highest. We can get a BMP in place that if it traps or even prevents the generation of nutrients, then that's going to give us more bang for our buck. So that's the focus here. We can look at looking at what's delivered to the bay. So Not surprisingly, this is on the eastern shore. You've got the highest load being delivered. It's right on the bay. What's generated here tends to go right into the bay waters. You get a little bit further away, less is delivered. Although we do see quite a bit over here. This is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where there's a high load. Also, more can be delivered based on geology. I will get to that. So we can integrate the highest ratio of what's delivered with the highest load generated. Helen Goluboski, who's on this webinar, has done some maps that are on CAST. Maybe she can put the link to those maps in the chat, but that's been really useful for people to see where they need to generate where they need to target based on delivery to the bay and on where the load is highest. Then the remaining opportunity is important. So if you've got a high load and a lot's delivered from this area, then if you've already saturated the land, then maybe that's not the best place to target because you've saturated it with BMPs. So Virginia went through and said, where is the remaining opportunity? And they indicated where there were fewer acres and where there were more acres to do more BMPs. And so that analysis tool has been useful for saying, here's where the opportunity is. And then the other thing that really engaged people quite a bit, and this surprised me, I've been doing it for more than a decade, but I always learn, is people started looking at these maps of what's carbonate or karst geology, where a lot's going to run through. You've got the coarse coastal plain, and then you've got these more clay soils, in the wider areas. And so in the carbonate or the coarse, more sandy coastal plain, more load is likely to be delivered. And that information really made people stop and say, hey, we need to target there. So this was a story that I knew was out there, but I didn't think it would engage people. But when people started showing this, it really got people's attention, and they're like, hey, we can target these places. This makes sense. And if this is what engages people, then great, let's use it. This started to engage a different group of people, and we were able to use this information and looking at these groundwater issues as well. So this was good. Thanks to USGS for all of their great science and support of the work in the Bay, and helping to translate it into story maps and understandable information. It's allowed us to engage people in a different way, get them to see things differently, start to take some different actions. We always need to look at tracking progress by comparing our loads to goals. So we have some easy comparison tools. Here's your planning target. Here's where you were before the TMDL 2009. Here's where you were in 2021. Here's where you are in the WIP, what you said you were going to do. So this is what you committed to doing, and this is where you are now meaning, a couple of years ago. And here's what you said you would do with climate change, which is for Virginia the same. Other states didn't have climate change in their WIP 3, and they had to go back and do it as a second step. Virginia was stepping forward and did it as part of their phase 3 WIP. So that was good. And we break this out by the different state major basins, by sources, by year. So there are all different kinds of things that can be put in these scenarios. And I tend to focus on nitrogen because generally if you meet nitrogen, you're likely to meet phosphorus and sediment. So we simplify it a little bit, but you do have to do the checks for phosphorus and sediment too. So here are a couple of our successes. Not surprisingly, they're where regulations are the tightest. We have had, look at this graph up here over time, and you can play this animation in CAST and see where the loads were the highest. You can see each of these facilities shrinking in terms of the load that's delivered. Red is industrial, blue is municipal, and we have had consistent and steady reductions over time as these wastewater and industrial facilities have reduced. We also have had reductions in air. That is thanks to the Clean Air Act and the fact that air is regulated and measurable, and the ratcheting down Even in years where we thought it wouldn't happen, it continued to ratchet down. And we're seeing the air continue to the atmospheric deposition continue to decrease. Those are our successes. We have reached low-hanging fruit for our non-point source BMPs, and here's where we get a little friction. And I didn't want to tell just the happy story. I want to tell you where we've had problems. We start to get the blame game among sectors. Ag says it's urban's fault. Urban says it's ag's fault. We have data to show what's going on, but we also end up with different states pointing the finger at the other one. And we've had lawsuits related to the Conowingo Dam, and we have newly developing urban areas, and whether there are requirements on that as opposed to the older urban areas that need to do retrofits where it's much more expensive. So we've had, some of the challenges there. In this area of Virginia, this is the Rappahannock. That is one of the fastest developing urban areas, new development in the nation. And so if they are successful in putting in tight controls for new development, then I think Virginia will meet its goals. If they are not, it's going to be harder, and it will fall on some of the older retrofit areas and on agriculture. So I'm really hoping they can do some tight regulations there for the new development. It is necessary to offset unanticipated and unplanned for increases. One of those is the Conowingo Dam, which is really a series of 3 dams. It's a hydroelectric dam used for power. It trapped phosphorus sediment and nitrogen to some degree for many, many years. We thought it would continue being able to trap kind of a big BMP. It has reached dynamic equilibrium, meaning in some years we see big storms that scour it out, and you see that load go downstream. And then it starts to fill up again, but overall it has reached equilibrium and is no longer trapping nutrients and sediment. That's something that we need to offset, and the states were asked to address the load coming down the Susquehanna for that issue. We have ever increasing population, and that needs to be accounted for. That is why the Watershed Implementation Plan, or WIPS, was done on a 2025 land use. It takes into account the expected population increases. And then we've had fluctuating fertilizer usage, and that is based on the crops that are planted, based on the markets, the cost for selling the crop, the different commodities, and it is also based on the cost of fertilizer. So states are not happy when they see more fertilizer being put down, and there's a lot of argument about, well, the data is not real, and we have to go back and say, well, these are the data we agreed to use. Let's see if there are any errors in it. And so those are some of the issues we look at. And then climate change was brought up earlier. We did not account for that in the 2010 plan, but we did bring that in starting in 2016, and we do have varying climatic conditions. Here are just a couple of examples of our data visualizations for urban and agriculture non-point sources. We can look, top left is urban. We can look at stormwater management, kind of lumped in a category, and then other urban practices. Then you can see the trends over time. In the bottom, you can see agriculture. Cover crops is that turquoise on my screen. Crop nutrient management is blue. Pasture management, we're looking in Virginia. There's a lot of pasture, is the pink. We look at model generated loads. This is just pounds of nitrogen at the edge of a small stream by year. So agriculture is green. We know most of the load comes from ag. The developed sector produces the red. It is growing because we can see that it's not that the load overall is growing, but we can see that in terms of pounds per acre, it is not growing. So there are controls in place. And while we model it, and we talk about these modeled numbers, and we work to have buy-in from everybody on the modeled numbers, we all agree and know that the model is only a model. While it's calibrated and it's pretty good, ultimately progress is going to be reflected in the monitoring data. And so we put those out there. And there are links on CAST to this too that shows the monitoring data over time for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And here you can see the differences. A lot of that's due to the different hydrology, but we also have it weighted by doing a regression for time and distance, taking out the different hydrologic effects of the year, so we can see the trend overall, controlling for flow. There are a number of resources available. I know the webinar is being recorded, so you can look at the recording, or NEIWPCC can make the PowerPoint available so you could click on those. But these are all things that are available on the CAST website, so you can access those. James and I love talking about the Chesapeake Bay and WIPS and tools and data visualizations. Feel free to contact us anytime. I've tried to answer questions as we go along, but I will pause here for any questions if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Thanks, Olivia. And I just want to point out that we've gotten, as you mentioned, we got a couple of great questions in the chat, but we also have a number of links in there as well. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend going through there. And when this webinar is posted, we will make sure to include those links there as well.
Thanks, Courtney. And I know that there's a survey. We really hope you fill out the survey. Maybe Ashley can put that in the chat again. So you fill out a survey after the webinar, but we are here and open to taking questions. Maybe I went too fast, James, and we lost people.
You know, I always have questions for you, Olivia. I was just trying to give somebody else a chance.
Yishen.
Hi, Olivia. This is Yishen from U.S. Global Change Research Program. I wonder for your future climate scenarios, projections incorporated into both planning and into the CAST model, because we're looking at local scales, watershed scales, what climate downscaling methods or tools are you using, or are you more or less relying on local tools? Thank you.
No, we are looking at, we've pulled in data looking at what the change in rainfall would be and the change in timing of that rainfall. So we've changed the hydrology based on national data and used that in our model to develop the estimated loads, and created, because the states were so far along with their watershed implementation plans, we created a separate goal on top of what they had to do. And that separate goal was for climate change. In the case of Virginia, they had already taken that into account, but in the case of other states, they've had to meet it a different way. Thursday, we actually have a CAST webinar talking about how the states have addressed that. And Helen can put in the chat the link to that CAST webinar on Thursday that she's giving. But we, but I know that Maryland decided they were going to address that additional reduction for climate change by just looking at wastewater treatment plants. Other states had already met it, and I know, you know, they're just different approaches depending on the state.
Thank you. Sorry if I'm belaboring the point, but my question was regarding what national data are you guys using? Is it, say, downscale CMIP6 data set, or is it a real-time measurements? Thank you.
Yeah, we actually, I think for the 2025 estimated climate change, they principally used forecast forward as opposed to the downscaled global climate models, but they did use, as we looked further out in time, right, they used the global climate models downscaled and kind of transitioned from that data projection to the downscaled global climate model as the basis for those forecasts. And climate change is really interesting in the Chesapeake. While we're going to get wetter, we're also going to get warmer, right? So more precipitation, more intense precipitation, but also more evapotranspiration, and most importantly, perhaps, increased water temperatures and increased sea level rise, right? Which increases circulation with the ocean in the Chesapeake and has the potential to improve our water quality conditions, certainly in the lower bay here by Virginia. So it's a really interesting push-pull dynamic going on with climate change. Some things helping, some things hurting.
Thank you so much.
And Elizabeth asked a question about, is the model land use driven? There certainly are a lot of land uses in the model, and it is really important for planning. And we do have a different loading rate for each land use. However, we also model the amount of nutrients applied to that land use. So in the case of agriculture, we've got all the different crops that are in the ag census, and we look at what is the amount of inorganic fertilizer and manure that's applied to the crops in the urban sector, applied to, say, the turf grass lawns, as well as atmospheric deposition that comes down. And that is really what the model is most sensitive to, are the nutrient inputs. Yeah,
but I'll add that the land use in the model, Olivia touched on it earlier, that if you try to engage with a local government official and you present to them model data that says they have 5,000 acres more impervious surfaces than that local government knows they have, you might as well just go ahead and pack it up and leave the room, because they're not going to engage with you, right? They're going to tell you your model's wrong, and it's a non-starter. So having that accurate land use information, which was a tremendous improvement between our previous model that was used in the phase 1 and phase 2 WIP and the phase 6 version of our watershed model that was used in the phase 3 planning process, we increased our land use resolution 900-fold, right?
Yeah.
We went from 30-meter imagery to 1 meter.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the model is not that sensitive to land use, and the land use doesn't make that much difference.
But the loading rates do.
The loading rates do, yeah. But it certainly helped with getting buy-in from people, and it was worth every penny to get the buy-in from people so that they are ready to take actions.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, I have a great question from Andrew Craig, who wants to know if soil phosphorus levels on ag fields are taken into account. We reached out to all of the public and private labs and asked for their soil test phosphorus data, and some provided it, some didn't, but from that we were able to come up with the soil phosphorus levels throughout generally by land use, more general land use, and geographically, spatially, and take into account the soil phosphorus levels. We use the Apple model, applied phosphorus land estimator model. That's a Penn State model. We used Apple to see what the soil phosphorus level would be, say 25 years out, when it had reached more of an equilibrium given certain management. And we do use that as one of the model parameters. So it is a factor that we consider in runoff. And that was really important to the agricultural community as well. Sometimes we model things not because they make much of a difference from a modeling perspective, but because they make a big difference in terms of engagement in environmental improvement.
Thanks, Olivia. Appreciate the response on the soil P question.
And thank you again, Olivia and James. I think we're at the end of our webinar, but I just wanted to take a moment again to thank our presenters today. That was a really great presentation, and we will have it posted on YouTube, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So we'll send out another kind of informational thing once that is posted, and we'll make sure to include all of the links and everything. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.